Hello, I'm KCPT's Nick Haynes.
And I'm Dia Wall with 41 Action News. We're at Lincoln College Prep, where the protests began 50 years ago.
And those protests would lead to riots that would claim 6 lives, 300 arrests, and multiple blocks of the city in flames.
Tonight, a special report on what happened.
And stay with us for a conversation with eyewitnesses, political leaders, historians, and with you.
And now, 68, the Kansas City race riots, then and now.
The line of mourners is endless. This is probably going to be quite simply the greatest funeral ceremony ever accorded a private person in the United States.
On this National Day of Mourning in memory of Dr. Martin Luther King, many Americans teeter on the edge of fear.
Due to mob action and civil disobedience, a state of emergency exists within the city of Kansas City, Missouri.
Here in the state capitol, Governor Warren Hern says he's ordering elements of the National Guard to Kansas City.
Fires are raging out of control in the area bounded by 36th and Prospect through 39th and Prospect.
The city's general hospital received victims of the violence throughout the night. 4 were dead on arrival. One of these was a 12-year-old boy.
Yes, 15 persons injured in shooting incidents, 75 fires, and nearly 200 businesses looted. That's part of the tally in the Kansas City civil disorder.
I seriously question the necessity of throwing tear gas where children are congregated. An investigation should be made.
68, Kansas City's race riots then and now, is a joint presentation of KCPT Public Television, 41 Action News, and the Kansas City Public Library.
It all started here. Hundreds of high school kids in Kansas City were heartbroken after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the school district's failure to give them space to grieve. What started as a student protest grew in size and intensity to the point that it forever changed this community. Give me 30 minutes. Let me tell you a story. The who, what, when, where, but most of all, the why. It may make you proud, and it may make you cry. But my hope is that it reminds us all of how far we've come and inspires us to come together the rest of the way.
NBC interrupts its regular program schedule to bring you the following special report.
Martin Luther King Jr. was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
I was in this room 50 years ago, sitting somewhere near the north door, morning of the 9th of April, 1968.
Grace and Holy Trinity Church organized a special service honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. days after his assassination. There was a speaker.
A young lady walked up and handed him a note, right here. He handed him a note, and he says, "Thank you. Is there a Mr. Alvin Brooks in the congregation?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You have an emergency call." It was Robert Wheeler, who was Assistant Superintendent of Urban Education for the Kansas School District. And he said, "Al, as we predicted last night, all hell's broken loose."
District officials met the night before to discuss closing KCPS schools for Dr. King's funeral. The 3 African Americans voted to close the schools. Everyone else said they should stay open. Ultimately, the superintendent, James Haslett, stepped in.
Haslett decided, the superintendent decided, well, here's what we'll do. They just completed the school at 42nd in Indiana. Let's name it Martin Luther King Jr. High School, and then fly all the flags on all the school properties half-mast. That wasn't good enough for us, but it was good enough for them, and so that's why the schools were open.
On April 9th, 1968, students from Lincoln Prep, Manual, and Central started calling each other.
I mean, King got shot, and it was like, what? They'd killed Martin Luther King? Right. Here he was out there trying to do good, trying to do it peacefully, and for that to happen?
And Kansas City, Kansas had allowed its students to come out of school, and that troubled the kids in the Kansas City School District.
We're gonna walk out because the school is telling us to all stay in, and so we walked out.
The kids from Lincoln went first. Then the students from Manual. Hundreds of them all went to Central. And when they got there, the group merged together and headed to City Hall.
It looked to me, they say 300, It looked like me, 1,000 people coming to northbound on the Paseo, and they were like sidewalk to sidewalk.
And the 17th Terrace and Paseo is where the mayor came out and spoke to them.
Mayor Ilis Davis told the students they could go to City Hall.
I think the butterflies went to my stomach all the way up, oh, shoot,
And the kids went up north through the I-70 and then walked west on the eastbound lane.
Bruce R. Watkins leading the way, fist raised in the air.
I remember that march. My dad was serving as mayor pro tem, first African-American city councilman, now serving mayor pro tem during the riots. So I can see him feeling a personal responsibility, not only as a elected official, but as a person concerned.
Watkins was also the first African-American elected to county-wide office. 71 Highway is named after him. But on April 9th, 1968, he was grieving Martin Luther King's death too.
The most well-respected civil rights leader in this country, in the world, was just assassinated. The atmosphere, the mood of that time was still very on the edge.
It was already fuming. Even before his death, we were conscious of the fact that it was a separation of different colors.
1968 was also in the heart of the Black Power movement. African Americans were feeling newfound pride in their heritage. Everything from fashion to music to the raised fist became a symbol of solidarity and resistance in the face of discrimination. That symbol is still used today.
We were ensconced in that, and we were ready to fight on our end.
Bruce R. Watkins was too.
It's time for a change. It's time to march. It's time to do.
I felt like we were empowered to do something.
I was a city desk reporter at the Kansas City Star, and during that period of the march, there was no damage. The kids, no doubt, were angry, but they weren't causing any trouble. They were not breaking windows or anything like that.
The students made it to City Hall. At the same time, KMBC cameras recording as a police line was forming.
We all got in a semicircle, just a group of us. I mean, there was nobody there except a bunch of cops and highway patrolmen. And there was a black female walked in the line in front of us, and she was cursing us and yelling at us. And all of a sudden, I saw a soft drink bottle from behind her come flying over her and broke. And next thing I heard was click, click, click. That's the sound of a pin being pulled with a gas grenade, and the gas, boom. And I mean, it was all over because, we had the gas masks and stuff.
A whole bunch of tear gas went out in that crowd, and I think it made the crowd very, very mad. And I think the riot started at that moment.
And that afternoon, evening, the burning started.
It was hurt that brought the kids here to the steps of City Hall. But once the tear gas cans started flying, smoke filling the air, burning their eyes and their skin, the protesters moved from hurt to angry.
Personally, this is my own personal opinion, I didn't see a need for that first gas can. I mean, it was a pop bottle. It was one single soft drink bottle. It wasn't even close to the officers.
As an officer, what was your feeling? Did you feel like this is the right call, this is the wrong call? Oh no.
It's a term you can't use on TV. I'll just say, oh, sucks.
KMBC cameras were rolling as school district and city leaders brought in buses to get the kids away from City Hall and calm things down.
Call Father Timothy Given over at Holy Name Catholic Church at 23rd and Benton about opening the church for these kids, because that's where they had teen towns every weekend. The police followed them out there on these buses. The kids were in there, the music was blasting and everything, and then of course the police were there and they started taunting the police. And then police threw tear gas into the basement of the church.
Witnesses described screams coming from below as officers blocked the doors. Others say police didn't even know the dance was going on.
Those young people had been completely honorable, peaceful, organized, and caring all the way from 7 o'clock in the morning. When the tear gas began to hit people and they felt like it was being done for nothing, for no reason at all, then there was this sense of, I gotta do something. Once that happened and people fanned back out into the community, then all of a sudden it began to turn into fires and that the story of the riot began there.
At 3:21, the first shot is fired. At 4:17, the first Molotov cocktail is launched. By 5:20, Mayor Davis declared a state of emergency and imposed the first emergency curfew in Kansas City's history.
Is it pretty bad around? It's pretty bad. It's bad everywhere.
As day turned to night, reports of looting, vandalism, and arson took over the airwaves. KMBC cameras were there as fire alarms sounded every 2 minutes.
As the night went on, it became scary because then the tanks are going down our neighborhood. It was a curfew.
It's gunshots, ma'am. Just stay inside.
State troopers had already been called in.
I heard a voice come out of the creek and said, "Go back into the house." It was the National Guard. They were camped down in Brush Creek.
Rioters attacked numerous white people and targeted white-owned businesses too.
Race relations were shattered, and the city faced a real challenge.
This wasn't unique. Starting in 1964, there were riots all across the country. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Detroit. There were almost 160 riots in the summer of 1967 alone. All of them stemmed from rising racial tension.
68, there was real anger.
These images from Ferguson in 2014 look very similar to the ones taken decades before. People in one community who seem miles apart.
We think of us against them sometimes, And when I say them, I mean anybody who ain't the police is one of them, so to speak.
In the days that followed, 6 black men were killed during the rioting. Maynard Goh, Charles Martin, George McKinney Jr., Julius Hamilton, and Albert Miller. One with a case of whiskey in his hands, another with a hand in his pocket, 2 others just watching the fires, another following police orders.
None of them were armed. None of them had a confrontation with the police.
They were all shot by officers. No one ever charged in their deaths. Many in the black community feel scenarios like this are repeating themselves today.
The rumors were terrible. And there were people going around saying, "Oh man, them police going out and just shooting people on the street for no reason, just driving around shooting them, And I knew that wasn't happening.
But there was violence.
Kids laying on the ground. I said, "Hey, Bubba, what happened to him?" He said, "Oh, he cut his head on the glass when he came out of the building, split the head open." Okay, I said, "Wait a minute. He was already outside when I left." Okay. He pulled his gun out and he said he cut up in this piece of glass. And I knew what he meant. He decked him. As I looked back at it, I said, God, we were worse than some of the people who we were trying to arrest,
Today, police departments are grappling with the danger their officers face, working to protect those who protect us. At the same time, people are calling for fairness and enforcement when it comes to communities of color.
What do you think now, 2018, would help relationships between the police department and the community?
I'm from the old school. Communicating with the community. I'd like to think that the officers we're getting now and the policies and the way this department's, turned around, that sort of thing doesn't happen again.
It was an earth-shattering year, and the riots in Kansas City changed everything. "31st Street, which had a lot of African-American businesses, was essentially burned to the ground.
And the entire skyline of the city is lit up with flames. The worst seems to be from about 27th to 39th Street around Prospect, and every one of those blocks is a war zone.
I can recall being on my aunt's porch. She was at 32nd and Cleveland, just a block over from Mercington. And we stood on her porch in the dusk and we could see the fires on 31st Street.
First responders who came to help became targets for the rioters. KMBC cameras caught the aftermath.
African Americans began to throw bottles and bricks at firefighters who came over to answer, the fire bill to put out the fires.
I was a junior in high school. I lived on Montgall Avenue, 44th and Montgall, 1 block east of Prospect. Some buildings and some things were being burned a block away from where we lived.
Did it make any impact on you?
Yeah, it did. I mean, I still remember it, and I still remember the feeling. When you look at the looting and the arson and the vandalism, people had specific reasons for why they targeted some businesses and why they didn't hit other businesses.
And then people started putting signs on their windows, Soul Brother, to keep from getting burned down or looted or whatever.
Hundreds of businesses and buildings were destroyed. The property damage KMBC filmed would amount to almost $30 million today.
My mother kept telling us, why are we burning down our own things?
Well, because that's the only world they knew. To go west of truth was to die. And I think everybody realized that, if not consciously, certainly subconsciously.
Did we make a statement by getting out the rage? Yeah, but to burn down our own things didn't make any sense at that time.
So you see, again, from the perspective of somebody my age, those were not our things. Those were people who came into our neighborhood, did their business, and left at the end of the day.
Right.
So it didn't matter to us,
The 1968 Mayor's Commission report, released a few months later, identified why the rioting happened. It lists things like inequities in the educational system, a lack of adequate job opportunities, long-standing difficulties with the police department, and housing problems and frustration with efforts to fix it.
This was a political statement. This was using violence to communicate in a way that nonviolence had been used in the South. Now, was it a good idea? No, not really, but it was articulate.
44 people were hurt in the riots. The area around 31st and Prospect has never returned to the thriving business community it once was.
Yeah, 50 years ago, and it doesn't seem that long.
You get the sense that the riot could happen just a couple of months ago. All of those issues that caused the riot are still there.
This community was far more vibrant decades ago. The 1970 U.S. Census shows just over half of African-American headed households own their homes. But in the latest census in 2016, that number was down to just 37%. The number of African-Americans in the city who are not in the workforce is up too, from 32% in 1970 to 36% in 2016. But unemployment overall has dropped from 12.6% in 1970 to 7.6% 2 years ago. Graduation rates paint an optimistic picture as well. At the college level, going from just 3% to 15%, and at the high school level, from 31% to 85%. Yet Kansas City Public Schools remain unaccredited. Finding quality, affordable housing is still a challenge, and the unemployment rate is still higher for African Americans than it is for white Kansas Cityans. What lessons can we learn from these riots 50 years ago? Why does it matter today?
The lessons that can be learned is that when you have disaffected people and you do not address their concerns over a period of time in a way that's constructive, you are going to have more riots. It's just that simple. When you have situations where people feel that they have no recourse and no hope, they'll take to the streets and start burning stuff up.
Once again, young people are taking the lead on a movement to enact change. On March 24th, thousands gathered at Tice Park for the March for Our Lives protest, pushing for gun reform. The local rally, organized in part by some of these Lincoln College prep seniors, who staged a walkout of their own on March 14th. We wanted to know how they feel about their fellow alum walking out 50 years ago.
Impressed but not surprised.
Exactly. I feel like it's a Lincoln trait that we have. That's wild.
Yeah, I feel like we could do that, but like knowing that they did that without any cell phones and like they organized that themselves, that's wild to me. That makes me really proud. Yeah,
proud.
Like knowing that these kids were our age and they're doing big things like that.
And it started at our school.
Yeah.
The major change that always happens is when a new generation with different ideals or different beliefs on what should be done comes in and creates change.
We're always thinking about stuff like that.
Every issue that America has, the youth should have some type of input on it, because we are the ones who will see the consequences and the repercussions whether good or bad.
This was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
Why is it important? Why are we even talking about this now? It's ancient history.
Because America has never dealt with the issue of race in America.
We're in a climate today that I think is much worse than we were 50 years ago.
You know, racism has kind of grown up. Put a suit and tie on.
We have a serious problem in that people believe that it's all over, and that inhibits us from making it better.
How do we make it better?
Well, we make it better by people recognizing, first of all, that this is not nirvana, that we have not reached perfection on the issue of race.
In many ways, we are still divided.
Mostly white Americans see the 60s as a time of decline for the United States, when we lost our way, when people became disrespectful of law and order and lost a certain amount of patriotism. But by and large, African Americans see the 60s as a very redemptive time.
Black people, in fact, had been amazingly patient. How they kept it under control in that era is hard to figure out.
In the 5 decades since the 1968 riot, some things have changed dramatically.
People in Kansas City really ought to feel pretty good about things they've done. We had a fire chief, a police chief, we had black superintendents, we've had a black chair of the Chamber of Commerce. I mean, and it goes on and on and on.
Recent protests in Kansas City have all stayed peaceful.
Fortunately, we've got a police department that's been pretty good about protests and how they've responded.
But in other areas, there's still room to improve.
Some of the same issues that we faced in 1968 that were the crux of the rioting around this nation, to a degree, still exist in urban America today.
We got to think about economic development. We have to think about education, and we have to think about housing.
But I also think that on the governmental level, we have to enact policies and recognize that there are differences and that some things have been done in order to perpetuate a bad system, and we have to create policies that address those issues.
Then, lean in to people who are different than you.
Just because we're black doesn't mean that we know everything about the tensions between black and white. We have to be willing to learn.
50 years later, do you look back at 1968 and say that it was worth it?
Oh, sure, it was worth it.
Oh, heck yeah. It was worth it, and it wasn't worth it, because again, to this day, that it has not come back.
I don't advocate riots and confrontation, but it does raise the consciousness.
KMBC cameras caught the aftermath.
I think it succeeded in that. I mean, there was a certain renewed commitment to these problems that obviously shaped a lot of people's lives.
If you knew in 1968 what you know now about that riot, when they called you out of this church, what would you have told those kids?
Let's go to City Hall.
What started as a story about a student protest became the story of Kansas City and really our nation. One group blind to the needs of another, and chaos because of it. 50 years later, we're having the same debates and the same problems in our communities. It's been over 18,000 days since April 9th, 1968. Let's not waste one more, allowing our differences to divide us. I'm Dia Wall. Thanks to Kansas City Public Television for collaborating with us on this project, as well as the UMKC LaBuddy Collection and the Kansas City Public Library. And thank you for watching 68, the Kansas City race riots then and now.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello, I'm Nick Haynes. Did we learn the lessons of the riots of 1968? The rioters spoke loudly. Were they heard? In August of last year, Dia Wall, reporter and anchor of Channel 41, emailed me and said, Nick, would KCPT be willing to partner with Channel 41 in telling the story of the Kansas City riots? Dia Wall, by the way, is right here in the front, the person who was the brainchild for the project. The biggest surprise for you in doing this project, Dia, was what?
How many of the issues that were the cause of the riots, according to this report that was issued in 1968, we're still talking about today, 50 years later?
Dia, you are going to be taking questions from our audience tonight because we really want to engage you in this conversation. But we have others who you saw in the film who we're engaging tonight. Congressman Emanuel Cleaver moved to Kansas City in 1968. A decade later, he would be elected to the city council, and 2 decades later became the city's first black mayor. Our current mayor, Sly James, was coming home from an after-school job 50 years ago when the riots began. At a National Guard checkpoint, he was forced out of his car and onto the pavement. Former city councilman and the founder of Ad Hoc Group Against Crime, Alvin Brooks, was a Kansas City school district administrator when the riots broke out. He was one of the many civil rights and religious leaders who joined the student protest and marched with them to the steps of City Hall. Clarence Gibson was a fresh-faced police officer back then. He had a point-blank perspective on what was happening as he stood on the police line wearing a gas mask as tear gas flew. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Gibson. In 1968, Linda Spence felt the tear gas as a student at Central High School, which helped lead the student walkout. And Dr. Joel Rhodes is a Southeast Missouri State University historian who has conducted some of the most extensive research into this violent chapter in our local history. Thank you all for being with us. Now, we were told in the film that there were hundreds of disturbances all across the country. That is true. But few, Joel Rhodes, were as violent and with as many injuries as Kansas City.
There are more riots in the United States in the immediate days after King's assassination than in the entire year of 1967 combined. And aside from Washington, D.C. and Chicago, Kansas City's was as deadly and as volatile as any in the country.
Now, we'd like to say that there was no effort in Kansas City to allow people, the students, to memorialize Dr. King on his funeral on April 9th. But there was an effort to do so. There was a 1-minute observance, Sly James, in Kansas City schools that they permitted. That wasn't considered sufficient?
No, it wasn't sufficient because it didn't come close to capturing the gravity of the situation or the loss. It was tokenism in its earliest form.
50 years on, Emanuel Cleaver, have we learned the lessons of the 1968 riots?
No. I was in Ferguson on the second day, and it looked like tanks were rolling down a street in Iraq, one of the Iraqi cities, and it was difficult to believe that this was a little town of 20,000 people and troops from all over. It was one of the most intimidating things that most people in that the generation that was out on the streets had ever seen. They knew nothing about the riots.
You say in the film, Mayor Sly James, if you don't address the concerns of disaffected people, you're going to have a riot. But 50 years have taken place. We haven't had a riot like this before. Have we never risen to that level of disaffection again in Kansas City?
I don't know if I'd say we haven't risen to the level of disaffection, but I don't know that we've had the sparks to light the powder keg. The death of Martin Luther King was a seminal event, and it was something that charged the already latent anger and made it very active. I can't say that we've had the same type of atmosphere that would charge it, but I don't necessarily think that that means that all is good. Schools are still in the shape that they're in terms of their segregated nature. Jobs are still harder to come by. Neighborhoods are still suffering. So I can't tell you that it won't happen again. But the problem is that this country is not equipped politically to deal with the chronic problems of the country. In order to deal with chronic issues, you have to have sustainability and sustainable solutions. We don't have them.
It's easy to look back and recoil with horror at these scenes, but Clarence Gibson, who just, by the way, just retired this month from the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, the last remaining police officer who was there during the riot of 1968. But you say, quote, you can't judge those officers in 1968 by today's standards. What was different?
We were dealing with guys who were in World War II, whose mindset was a lot different than guys my age at the time who had just come back from Vietnam. And there were old timers out there, and I mean, there was anger among them, you know, more so than a lot of the young guys. But I just think it had to do with their backgrounds more than anything else.
We had an email from a police officer who was there too, now living in the Ozarks. His name is Jim, and he writes, quote, rioters made the mistake of confronting our lines, which were full of returned Vietnam vets, and we were commanded by World War II veteran officers. They picked the wrong generation to try and screw over, so we kicked some butt.
Leadership matters. Fast forward to 1992. After Rodney King, the officers in the Rodney King beating were acquitted, about 400 people gathered on Brush Creek. And she may even be here tonight, but Carol Coe called me in the mayor's office and said, there's a large crowd gathering. There are about 400 people, and they're still coming. We're getting ready to march to the plaza. And she said, you need to get out here. And so the police officer drove me out. The difference in what happened with Mayor Davis and the response from the police chief at the time, Clarence Kelly, Steve Bishop and I were on the phone and talking about the fact that we should not have any police going out there. We didn't need the helicopter flying above, and he agreed. And that was step one in preventing something from happening, because if police had come out, we were going to have a problem.
We also view this as a very specific area of Kansas City that was affected by this. We note, going through the historic record, that during the riot over the state line, Johnson County officials declare a state of emergency. What were they afraid was going to happen, historian Joel Rhodes?
Well, in fairness, when Mayor Davis asked for a state of emergency on the first night, he asked all the surrounding suburbs to follow suit, and Johnson County did that. The short answer is the plaza is the main concern, and when the first reinforcements of the National Guard are deployed, they're deployed in the plaza. There is a concern that the riot will spill over into this district, and you could not travel into Johnson County without providing the police department proof that you lived there or you were employed there.
Alvin Brooks.
One of the captains came out and told the businessmen at a meeting in the plaza, it was quoted in the Star, you don't worry, we've got them contained down there. The same thing at 31st and Truce. That same captain made the statement to the businessmen around 31st and Truce. Don't worry about it, we have them contained down there. That was a mentality that not only Kansas City was just a microcosm of what America was all about.
You say in the film, Congressman Cleaver, that people didn't want to, if they went west of Truce, that was death.
Absolutely. As long as they stayed in the Negro neighborhoods, things were okay. I mean, even if they were looting or burning. But it was crossing that Mason-Dixon line and getting close to the plaza. And that was the thing that I was afraid of back decades later. And I'm not sure that it's changed dramatically differently.
Did any positive change occur as a result of these riots? Did the riots actually make any conditions better?
I'm not sure how they would have made the conditions better when those conditions remained the same. The conditions that led to the riots still exist today. Those conditions won't change until we have the ability to engage in sustainable addresses of the problems that are there. The war on poverty was an abject failure, like the war on drugs. And we ought to stop going to war with it and start finding a way to collaborate with it and fix it.
Alvin Brooks.
One thing did happen. Public accommodation was passed. I am convinced that in April of 1968, if it had not been for the riot, the white community would not have passed the ordinance. When that referendum came, they would have voted against it. That was one thing. Yeah, I'm convinced. The kids are responsible for the passage of the emergency measure establishing fair housing in Kansas City.
The Mayor's Commission report comes out with more than 40 recommendations, a lot of them involving the police. There weren't enough police, is one recommendation. We need more. They were too underpaid. They need better pay. And they need to be far more representative of the community they serve. 7% of the police officers back in 1968 were African Americans, 7%. I did look today, we're at over 12% today. That is some progress. Linda, you're not too convinced. But that is progress. Mayor, you're on the police commission.
Yes. And?
Okay, so 7 to 12% wasn't a big enough impact for you?
No. No, the police department should look like the community it serves, which is one reason why when I hear the drumbeat of some of the officers wanting to be able to live outside of Kansas City and still police this city, I am so adamantly, completely, and irretrievably opposed to that. The way I look at it is very simple. If you can't live in the city, you can't police the city. So, and I don't want to make this a beat on the police situation, because there are a lot of police officers in this city who try very hard to do the right thing. The problem is that we still lag behind on basic understandings about people. There has to be a connection between the community and the police. And right now, it's better, but it is not fixed.
Clarence Gibson.
I agree with him 100%. We have footbeat officers downtown in the businesses. And I've argued, why don't we put footbeat officers in the community, communicate with the community, and build up a relationship? I volunteered.
What was the response to that when you were saying that?
But I remember when they had a Model Cities program, we had something called a Pinpoint Patrol. And I volunteered for that. We walked 2-man foot beats over on the west side, and I did a year over on 31st and Prospect area. We had what they call discretionary enforcement. We could handle things without taking them to jail. But the whole idea was most people do not deal with the police unless they've been arrested, getting a ticket, some distraught situation, somebody's died or something like that. As a footbeat officer, you're going into doors of each of the businesses, you're talking to people, you know people. I don't know how many times on the west side, hey, Gibson, Campbell, having tacos, come on in, you know. But we were we were their cops, in their mind. We were their cops. We weren't the other cops.
Even though the goals that you would like to see happen haven't taken place, did, though, the 1968 riots improve the nature of policing in Kansas City?
No, I think that's fairly clear here. And there is a testimony in the Mayor's Commission that didn't make it into that report that I think speaks to this perfectly. It said until J.C. Nichols advertises in the Kansas City Call, nothing is going to change.
We also want to hear from you, and Dia Wall will be taking your questions, and she'll have a mic over here, and you can come to her, and she will engage you in pithy, not huge, long political statements, but if you can have great questions in about 20, 30 seconds or so. Linda Spence.
I want to just dovetail on what they've been saying about, police becoming better or whatever, because recently in the state of Missouri, we've passed a law that a police officer doesn't have to be any further than high school, okay? Now, that's not good.
I think the report addressed that the police weren't paid enough.
Federal government has responsibility. When I was during my term as mayor, we were able to get community policing grants. But the problem with the community policing grants is that the government would do it for, I can't remember now, 3 or 4 years, and then the local department would have to assume the full cost. Most police stations in the United States can't do that. And so if the federal government is going to bail out of everything, we're going to have major problems, and that's exactly what we're seeing.
Okay. All righty. I have lots more questions, but I want to hear from Dia Wall, who has lots of questions from you.
This is Steve Patton.
My question is,
Was regular troops seriously considered or put on alert for deployment into Kansas City? Does anybody know that?
No.
No, I was
We,
gonna say, not to my
there was
understanding.
over 1,000 National Guardsmen here, though.
There were, and some of the units came from Carthage and Joplin, which is an interesting dynamic to bring white troops from the Ozarks into Kansas City.
Jeff Lewis.
I wondered if you all have been uplifted recently by the movements of the young people, particularly high school and college age people, not just in Florida, but also all around the country.
Having been a student at that time, I feel their pain. And yes, I'm very uplifted. I posted something on Facebook. I told them, keep going, and I'll follow.
When I asked, were there any benefits in the long run, you said very little progress had been made. So does that take away from the value of protest?
I don't want anybody to get the impression that we're saying that there's been no progress. I mean, the fact that Brooks, James Cleaver sitting up here is a very clear sign that we've had progress. There's no question about it.
I'm going to roll in 2 questions that we got from Facebook since we're streaming. So what's up to our online and social media audience? Aaron from Facebook Live wants to know, how much does community policing cost? And Robert wants to know, what's the legal alternative to violent protest and how to best go about it?
Community policing means you have to take police officers out of the car. We have 318 square miles. If we put a large contingency of officers walking, a lot of that miles is not going to be covered. So but I'm saying that community policing means a lot more police officers than we have with 1,400.
How do you feel about a larger police budget to accommodate that, Mayor James?
Every year I've been in office, that police budget has gone up. We are obligated under state law to give 20% of our general fund. We're closer to 40, 41, 42%. So there's money. But I disagree that everything comes down to the number of officers. When I'm told that we need more officers, and my question is, to do what? Because just putting people on there doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Do you agree with that, Clarence Gibson?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Pithy and insightful, dear Wall.
Rebecca Davis.
We're saying that part of the cause of the riot had to do with the lack of commemoration and respect for Dr. King after his death. What is Kansas City planning on doing 50 years on for that same type of commemoration?
The ugly side of that is that we've been struggling in Kansas City for the last year, a little over a year, trying to get a Martin Luther King street or boulevard or road. We're the only city in the United States, over 12,000, that doesn't have a street named Martin Luther King.
But back to the whole issue of commemorating. In the film, we saw the names of the 6 people who died, but there's nowhere in Kansas City that in any way honors and remembers that period in our history.
To answer your question, there's no central location where any recognition was given to those 6 persons who were murdered during the riots of '68.
It's been said, too, that there are parts of Kansas City, Missouri that have never been improved upon since 1968. Really?
You can drive down 31st Street today. I mean, there are signs still very present, Prospect, that would speak very eloquently to the fact that scars remain. The fires have gone out, but the scars remain.
Well, as I was saying, and to answer Dia's question, I think the Facebook question about is there an alternative to this? Well, that's the million-dollar question, because you can change foreign policy into war, you can pass legislation to change your gun laws, but how do you deal with white flight? How do you deal with underemployment, unemployment, segregated schools? These are beyond legislation. You can't legislate those. And so, again, what form of protest works?
Stacey Webb.
What do you speculate are the reasons why that we don't have a more racially representative makeup?
Linda?
Well, quite naturally, because most African American males have been adjudicated. So they've got records. Now,
Not most.
Well, not most,
yeah.
but quite a few.
Yeah.
Quite a few.
There's 3 of us up there.
Right, okay. All right.
I don't know about him.
I give you that. But a shout out to my grandson, who did graduate with a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and does serve on the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, and he's a very good officer. Grandma has to say it, but I mean, you would say so too. But that's the thing. You know, it's about the fact that we don't have that many who would qualify.
I think that some of what Linda says is certainly part of the reason, but I also think that it's basically systemic racism. You know, and I want to be clear here. I really want to be clear because I do not want to paint every police officer in this light because it is absolutely not true. But the bottom line is you don't have the number of police officers of color, just like we don't have the number of business people of color, teachers of color, CEOs of color, women, because there are certain things that have become so institutionalized as being white male dominated, and police departments are often like that. The other thing too is that we have more African Americans trying to get into the police department. The problem is once they get there is retention. It's easier to recruit than it is to retain, and it's very simple. You can make a very big effort to go out and find people of color to come join the police department. But if they come into an organization that is uncomfortable for them, they are going to leave. And we see that time and time again.
Alvin Brooks.
It's a matter of past history. And we as adults remember that history. 1968. I'm almost the oldest one here.
Almost.
I was a police officer in the 50s and the 60s, and I knew at that time that they never got any more than 1 or 2 black officers in any class. I came out, my class was the 44th class, came out in June 1st, in 1954. I was the only black of 27. The next class had 2, and it hasn't been much better than that since.
There's another reason too. The community does not encourage African American boys to join the police department.
Right. Yes.
And people who are African American police officers often find themselves in conflict with the community. There's still tension between the African American community and police. And if you're a black police officer, that tension takes on a different form.
Okay. Clarence Gibson, was that your perspective?
You know, I don't see the powers above being racism and wanting to say, get rid of these guys. I don't see that. We had our first black police chief, and we get a lot of good kids, African American in there, and we have some that going all the way up, but the retention is the big problem.
I want to go back to the questions in just a second, but the riots themselves on April 9th, 1968 was not just one day. This took place, first of all, over multiple days, right, Dr. Rhodes?
4 days.
The violence
Four days.
Yes.
How did it all come to an end? Was there a compromise reached?
No, I think actually with most all of the riots, 2 things happened. You cannot sustain this over a period of time, and in the case of Kansas City, it got colder. The temperature physically got colder, and what you see sociologically is that will generally end riots.
Congressman Cleveland.
Yes, I don't think any of the riots ended, whether it was in Kansas City or any place else, because people sat down at a table and said, we will end the riot at 3:30 tomorrow. I think they play out. They run out after people have made their statements and so forth. But I want to go back to very quickly to something that Alvin Brooks said, because it's important. And it goes to the question about why we can't get African Americans on the police department or interested in it. And he said, history. If you grew up in where I did in Texas, and the same was here, we had 2 black police officers, and one was Mr. Jesse and Mr. Boyd. I still remember them, and they could only arrest black people. Now, if they arrested a white person, they had to try to get him or her to stay there until. No, I'm not making this up.
You can't make this up.
And they had to stay. If they could get them to stay there, then a white officer would come in and arrest them.
Maybe.
Alvin Brooks, I understand that you also, as an African American police officer yourself, was told that you only could police certain areas.
When I came on in 1954, there were only 2 areas in this city that we could patrol. 12th to 23rd Truce to Paseo, 12th, 23rd, Paseo to Brooklyn. That was it.
Thank you very much. Dear Wall, more questions.
12-year-old Skylar Anderson.
We're thrilled to have you here, Skylar.
My question is, why are they so afraid of black youth using their voices?
Well, look, there's fear of youth, period. And all you have to do is to have seen what happened here and what happened in Washington with all of the young people. And it was a diverse crowd, black, brown, white, marching. It's young people, but it's important to understand, Alexander the Great was 22 years old when he conquered the world. Change is brought about by young people who get out and make things happen. Martin Luther King was 26 years old when he came out to become the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Montgomery, Alabama. And if you look at the civil rights movement, these were all young people in their 20s. The way things go is that young people saves the country. They save the country. Yes. We need you.
When you look at the current March for Our Lives, there were concerns, you saw it in some places, that these really weren't student-led, there were others involved. And when we look at the Mayor's Commission, they asked people, white people thought the single most important cause of the disturbance was radical leaders and instigators, while the second choice was just wanted to destroy. So we can look at it today and say, why is it that we were so afraid of those young voices? There were other fears at that time, Dr. Rhodes.
Well, and generally it's very comforting for a community to say, well, you know, our African-American population was happy. It must have been outside agitators. That came up in every city, came up in every college campus. And the Mayor's Commission also found that only 1% of the African-American community rioted. That to me doesn't make any sense. There were about 112,000 African Americans in Kansas City at the time. They arrested right at 1,000 people. So they arrested every rioter. That doesn't make sense. I think participation was much broader than what the Mayor's Commission led on, and it was young people. The average person arrested was between 17 and 24.
Dear Wall.
We've got another question from our social media audience, so thanks to all the people tuning in. How can we help new small businesses start on Troost and Prospect? That's coming from Lamont.
There's a couple of things that are going on Troost and Prospect. There's been a lot of capital and resources poured into Troost. One of the catalysts is the Urban Neighborhood Initiative of the Chamber. The issue with starting a business ultimately comes down to the capital to get a business started. We still have issues with banking and lending and redlining. And if you can't get capital, it's hard to get a business started.
Dear Wall.
Deborah Parmet.
I have one really brief comment before I ask my question, and it goes to what can you do that's not violent to change things, and it's vote. My question relates to the idea of policemen needing to live in the community. I agree with that. But shouldn't it be true for every city employee? Because if they work for the city, but they don't live here, what's their they're not vested.
They do. If we hire somebody that comes from outside the city, they have 6 months to move into the city. And if they don't, they lose their job.
We're going to take one more question because I want to be respectful of people's time.
All right, this is Preston.
As long as you have judges that's circumventing the law and not doing the things they're supposed to do, we're going to constantly have the conflict we have. What we're going to have to do what Martin Luther King and all those leaders did, we're going to go into the courtroom.
Well, first of all, I grew up in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I'm not aware of Martin Luther King going to court except when he was indicted on $132. I don't know about filing a lot of, they didn't have any money. Dr. King didn't have enough money to pay for his own funeral. Harry Belafonte paid for it. But it's important for you to understand that if you want good judges, it goes back to what the lady said earlier. You have to vote. We saw something unprecedented. I don't want to. You have to vote.
Alabama.
Alabama. No, let me ask before we end then, the biggest lesson of 50 years ago, which again seems so hard to believe, and for many people it may seem like ancient news. The biggest lesson for you, Alvin Brooks?
This is not a black, white kind of thing. it's an American dilemma. And again, Kansas City is a microcosm of what America is all about. And if we're to move from point A to point B, it has to be together.
To our historian, Dr. Joel Rhodes.
Most Americans still see this as a zero-sum equation, that if somebody gets something, it has to be taken away from somebody. And this country is rich enough, powerful enough, we can take care of these problems if we will sit down and come up with sustainable solutions.
Kansas City Mayor Sly James.
I firmly believe that the first step that everybody in this room can take is to establish some personal relationships with people that don't look like you. It would be very helpful, if we could get to know each other and understand that the stereotypes that we've had imprinted on our brains are simply not true. And you cannot do that by simply working with a black guy or working with a white guy and everybody going back to their individual segregated corners at night. The relationships have to expand. Out of those relationships come groups. Out of groups come movements. Out of movements comes change.
Linda Spence.
By the time I was 18, Martin Luther King was assassinated. At that time, I had a 6-month-old baby. And my thing was, what kind of a world am I bringing my son into? And so for me, it became a matter of, if I want change, I'm going to have to be the change. And I've worked towards that ever since. I'm now a master level social worker.
Kansas City Congressman Emanuel Cleaver.
Well, I think the riot should have taught us that change and betterment can never be achieved in one single event, that it has to be continually won over and over and over again. And in each new movement, we get better and better and better. We made some progress. We have to continue. We need that little young lady. We need her.
Need her, yes, yes.
On the police line in 1968, Clarence Gibson.
That is not a way to solve problems for a lot of folks, because there's people died in the riots that may still be alive and who might have been that one person who'd be sitting in the mayor's chair or the Congress's chair. These riots throughout the country killed a lot of young folks. And these could have been the youngsters who could have made the changes, or another Martin Luther King or something like that.
Ladies and gentlemen, our panel. On behalf of KCPT and our friends at Channel 41 and Dear Wall, who made it all happen, we thank you so very much. Thank you so much to our partners at the library who amplify all of our efforts in such a great way. We thank you for coming out tonight. Good night.